April 25, 1945. 16 meters below the Reich Chancellery's garden, Joseph Goebbels is seated at a modest wooden desk. The faint yellowish illumination from a single bulb casts shadows across his features. The concrete enclosure around him vibrates with each impact. Debris sifts from the ceiling as Soviet artillery shells find their mark. Somewhere overhead, Berlin is disintegrating, district by district, structure by structure. At this critical juncture, a messenger arrives, bearing tidings that will irrevocably fracture even Goebbels' meticulously crafted perception of reality. The Red Army's pincers have met. From the north and south, Zhukov's and Konyev's forces have joined hands near Ketzin, a locality west of the city. Berlin is now entirely encircled. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers form an impenetrable cordon. There will be no reinforcement. There will be no egress. There will be no salvation. For 12 years, Joseph Goebbels has served as the voice of Nazi Germany, holding the portfolio of Reich Minister of Propaganda. He was the architect capable of transforming any setback into a triumph, any withdrawal into a strategic maneuver, any catastrophe into a mere temporary hurdle. He dictated the prevailing narrative, sculpted public discourse, and commanded the very words that permeated millions of German households. Yet now, within this subterranean refuge, even Goebbels must confront a reality that defies manipulation. This is the account of what transpired when the supreme propagandist learned that the final act had commenced. To comprehend this moment, one must first understand the man. Joseph Goebbels, 47 years of age and standing barely 5 feet 5 inches tall, walks with a distinct limp, a consequence of childhood osteomyelitis. He has consistently offset his physical limitations with an extraordinary command of language. Words are his arsenal. Rhetoric serves as his shield, and for over a decade he has wielded these instruments with devastating efficacy. He recognized the potency of radio at an early stage. While his fellow Nazi leaders relied on mass rallies and printed media, Goebbels grasped that a voice entering every German living room held more sway than 1,000 speeches delivered in beer halls. He rendered Hitler's voice intimate and familiar, an omnipresent figure at the dinner table. He transformed propaganda into a form of entertainment, embedding ideology within music and drama, rendering the party's message inescapable. And he firmly believed this was paramount. Goebbels was not simply a calculating manipulator, though he undeniably was that. He harbored genuine admiration for Hitler, wholeheartedly embraced the Nazi ideology, and truly believed in Germany's eventual victory. His fanaticism was authentic. His propaganda exerted as much influence over him as it did over his audience. However, by April of 1945, even Goebbels' grip on reality was faltering. The preceding week, on April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, the remaining high-ranking Nazi officials convened in the bunker. Goering was present, as were Himmler, Speer, Ribbentrop, and Bormann, the core circle, or what remained of it. The birthday observance was surreal. Above ground, Soviet artillery fire was already impacting Berlin's eastern outskirts. The distant thunder of ordnance provided a somber backdrop to the strained festivities. One by one, they implored Hitler to depart, to retreat south to the Berghof, to continue the struggle from the Alpine redoubt. There were still loyal military units in Bavaria and Austria, the war could persist. Hitler refused. Berlin was his chosen battleground, the place where the Reich would either be preserved or annihilated. Most of the leadership departed that day. Goering headed south, already strategizing his ascent to leadership. Himmler absconded to pursue clandestine peace negotiations with the Allied powers. Speer bid a final emotional farewell before leaving. They perceived the situation with clarity. This was the conclusion. But Goebbels remained. He relocated his entire family into the bunker. His wife Magda, elegant and devout, herself a fervent believer, and their 6 children, Helga, aged 12, Hilda, aged 11, Helmut, aged 9, Hold, aged 7, Ha, aged 5, and Heide, aged 3. 6 children whose names were deliberately selected to echo Hitler. 6 children who would never witness the arrival of May. Traudl Jung, one of Hitler's secretaries, observed their arrival. The children appeared enthusiastic, she later recounted. They believed they were embarking on an adventure. The bunker resembled a cavern, something from a storybook. They raced through the narrow passageways, their voices reverberating off the concrete walls. They failed to grasp that their parents had brought them to their tomb. Goebbels maintained his established routines. Each day he continued to compose propaganda. He still broadcast to any German forces capable of receiving him. He still issued directives to newspapers that no longer existed and to radio stations that had been overrun. The propaganda ministry building above ground was a derelict ruin, yet Goebbels persisted as if the state apparatus were still functioning. On April 19th, he delivered his final radio address to the nation. His voice, that familiar instrument of persuasion, crackled through the airwaves. He spoke of ultimate victory, of secret weaponry, of the enemy's imminent collapse, and of Germany's resurgence from this fiery ordeal. It was a masterful example of the genre. Even then, even with Soviet tanks penetrating the city's periphery, Goebbels could weave words into a tapestry of hope. Soldiers in isolated pockets, cut off from all information, heard that broadcast and believed that succor was on its way. Civilians huddled in basements heard it and experienced a flicker of faith that perhaps, somehow, things would turn out for the best. But within the bunker, Goebbels possessed a different understanding. Rochus Misch, Hitler's bodyguard and telephonist, managed the switchboard in the bunker's communications room. He observed Goebbels closely during those final days. What struck him was the contrast in Goebbels' demeanor. Goebbels appeared animated, confident, brimming with plans and strategies. He spoke of Vank's 12th Army marching to relieve Berlin. He detailed how Steiner's assault from the north would shatter the Soviet encirclement. He painted scenarios of victory with the same skill he had employed in countless propaganda pieces. However, when alone, or with Magda, Goebbels presented a different aspect. Quieter, his face gaunt, his energy drained. He moved as if already deceased, merely going through the motions, until his spirit caught up with his physical form. The bunker itself was a peculiar environment. 30 to 40 individuals were crammed into a space designed for a considerably smaller number. The upper bunker, the fore bunker, was connected to the deeper Führer bunker via a spiral staircase. Hitler occupied chambers on the lower level. Goebbels and his family resided in rooms on the upper section. Guards, secretaries, agitators, and medical personnel were all accommodated in the remaining spaces. The air was dense, stagnant, recirculated through insufficient ventilation. The scent of unwashed bodies, of acrid sweat, and of the chemical latrines permeated everything. The lights flickered with every nearby detonation. Water was scarce, and food supplies were dwindling. They subsisted on canned goods, on the Reich Chancellery's diminishing provisions, and on whatever soldiers could salvage from the wreckage above. And the children continued to play. That was perhaps the most unsettling element. While adults debated strategy and defeat, while Hitler raged and wept, while Magda Goebbels moved through the bunker like a phantom, the 6 children engaged in games of hide-and-seek in the corridors. They sang songs and inquired when they might return home. Helmut, the sole boy, aged 9, wore a uniform his mother had fashioned for him, a miniature soldier. He saluted the guards, who returned his salute with carefully neutral expressions. The girls, in their matching dresses, seemed to belong to a world that no longer existed above ground. April 21st. Soviet troops entered Berlin proper, no longer confined to the suburbs, but penetrating the city itself. Zhukov's forces advanced from the east, Konyev's from the south. They progressed methodically, block by block, building by building. German resistance was fierce, but ultimately futile. Aged men of the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, confronted panzer tanks with panzerfausts. Hitler Youth, boys aged 14 and 15, threw themselves into the fray with more bravery than discretion. SS units fought with fanatical resolve, aware that no quarter would be granted if they were captured. The city became an inferno. Soviet artillery pounded everything. Katyusha rockets screamed overhead. Buildings crumbled into rubble. Fires raged unchecked. Civilians sought refuge in basements, in subway tunnels, anywhere underground. The deceased lay in the streets. No one could attend to them, not even move them. Berlin was transforming into a necropolis. Within the bunker, reports arrived, each more dire than the last. The Soviets had captured this district, that bridge, this governmental edifice. The net was tightening. Goebbels continued to issue orders. He commanded the Berlin garrison to fight to the last man. He decreed that any soldier who retreated would face execution. He dispatched messages to units that were no longer in existence, demanding counterattacks and the defense of positions lost days prior. General Helmut Weidling, appointed Commandant of Berlin on April 23rd, attempted to convey the gravity of the situation to the bunker inhabitants. A seasoned soldier, a veteran of the Eastern Front, he understood military realities. He presented the true situation to Hitler and Goebbels. His forces were critically short of ammunition, fuel, and all essential supplies. The Soviets outnumbered them 10-1, and in some sectors 20-1. Goebbels listened to these reports with an inscrutable expression. Misch, observing from his post, could not decipher it. Was it acceptance or denial? Perhaps a blend of both? Hitler continued to speak of relief. Wank's army was approaching. Felix Steiner would attack from the north. The Americans would recognize their error and ally with Germany against the Bolsheviks. It was pure fantasy, delusion, the final, desperate emissions of a mind incapable of confronting reality. But Goebbels knew. He had always possessed superior intellect to Hitler, a greater capacity for objective analysis when he chose to apply it. He was aware that Wank's army was a broken formation, barely capable of self-defense, let alone marching to Berlin's aid. He knew Steiner's planned offensive had never materialized because Steiner lacked the necessary troop strength. He understood that the Americans were engaged in a race with the Soviets to seize as much German territory as possible, not preparing to shift allegiances. The Minister of Propaganda recognized that the narrative was concluding. He simply lacked the words to articulate it. April 24th. The Soviet noose continued to constrict. Forces from the north and south converged, poised to meet imminently. Soon, Berlin would be completely isolated. The airfields were already under bombardment. The last flights had departed days earlier. The roads had become death traps. Anyone attempting to leave the city encountered Soviet patrols, tanks, and artillery. That evening, Goebbels sat with Magda in their confined quarters. Traudl Junge, passing by, overheard their conversation. Their voices were subdued, intimate. Magda was weeping, not with loud theatrical sobs, but with quiet, persistent tears. Goebbels held her hand. They were discussing the children. Magda had made her decision. The children would not survive this. She refused to allow them to grow up in a world devoid of National Socialism. She would not permit them to be captured by the Soviets, raised as communists, and indoctrinated to despise everything their parents held dear. It was preferable, she felt, for them to die as martyrs, to perish in purity. It was, of course, madness, monstrous madness. Yet within the bunker, in that subterranean tomb, with the world collapsing above, madness had become the norm. The perverted logic of fanaticism rendered murder akin to mercy. Goebbels concurred with his wife. He had always deferred to her judgment concerning their children. For all his public ferocity, Goebbels was more tender with his family, but he would not oppose her. He could not. To do so would be to concede that their entire belief system was fundamentally flawed, and such an admission was unthinkable. April 25th, early afternoon. The messenger arrived with the news. Soviet units from Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, advancing from the east, had made contact with troops from Konyev's First Ukrainian Front, pushing northward from the south. They had converged at Ketzen an der Havel, a small town west of Berlin. The encirclement was complete. Goebbels received the report in the conference room. Several officers were present, including Weidling and Krebs, the chief of staff, along with a few others. The messenger, a young lieutenant, delivered the information in a flat, exhausted tone. He had not slept for 3 days. His uniform was torn and soiled. He smelled of smoke and blood. Silence descended upon the room. Weidling later described Goebbels' reaction. The propaganda minister sat utterly still. His face, typically so animated and expressive, became vacant. For approximately 10 seconds, he uttered nothing. He simply gazed at the map spread across the table, at the red lines denoting Soviet positions, at the shrinking blue enclave representing Berlin. Then he spoke. His voice was soft, almost conversational. "So it is done," he said. "The ring is closed." Someone mentioned Vank, the 12th Army, suggesting they might still break through. Goebbels looked up. His eyes, as Weidling recalled, held a peculiar quality, not quite focused, as though he were perceiving something beyond the room, beyond the bunker, beyond the present moment. "Vank is not coming," Goebbels stated. "Steiner is not coming. No one is coming. We are alone." It was the first instance anyone in the bunker had heard him articulate the truth so plainly. No propaganda, no obfuscation, no hopeful reinterpretation, merely the stark, brutal fact. The meeting proceeded. They discussed defensive strategies, ammunition reserves, and the anticipated duration of the garrison's resistance. Goebbels participated mechanically, offering suggestions and approving plans. However, something fundamental had shifted. The fervor, the manic conviction that had driven him for 12 years, had vanished. Following the meeting, he returned to his family's living quarters. Magda was reading a fairy tale to the children. Helga, the eldest, sat close to her mother, too old to fully embrace fairy tales anymore, but eager to maintain the illusion for her younger siblings. The younger ones listened with wide-eyed attention. Goebbels stood in the doorway, observing. Misch, passing through the corridor, saw him there. The propaganda minister's face was streaked with tears. He made no sound, no discernible movement, merely stood there, weeping silently, watching his children. That evening, Goebbels visited Hitler. The Führer was in his sitting room, slumped in a chair. He appeared aged, his hands trembling incessantly. Parkinson's disease, some surmised, while others attributed it to the cumulative stress, the physical manifestation of defeat. They conversed for over an hour. No one else was present, so the precise content of their discussion remains unknown. However, afterward, both men seemed calmer, resigned. They had made their decisions. Hitler would commit suicide, refusing to be captured or paraded through Moscow as a trophy for Stalin. He would die on his own terms, at his chosen time. Goebbels would remain with him until the very end, then follow him into death. The propaganda continued in a bizarre fashion. On April 26th, German radio still broadcast messages of encouragement. Goebbels had pre-recorded statements that played in rotation, urging soldiers to hold firm, assuring civilians that aid was imminent, and informing the world that Germany would never surrender. But within the bunker, preparations for death were underway. Hitler commenced dictating his will, his political testament, his final messages to the German populace and to history. Traudl Junge transcribed his words, her fingers trembling on the keys. The Führer blamed everyone but himself. The generals, he asserted, had betrayed him. The German people, he claimed, had proven unworthy. International finance, he alleged, had orchestrated the entire conflict. It was a document steeped in delusion and denial. In one of his final acts, Hitler appointed Goebbels as Reich Chancellor. For approximately 24 hours, the propaganda minister would hold the nominal leadership of Nazi Germany. It was a hollow honor, a title devoid of power, a position without purpose. Yet Goebbels accepted it with grave solemnity. April 27th, 28th, 29th. The days blurred together. Above ground, the battle intensified. Soviet forces were now within mere blocks of the Reich Chancellery. Machine gun fire echoed through the devastated streets. Tank cannons boomed. The acrid scent of cordite and death drifted down into the bunker through the ventilation shafts. The children still played, though with less boisterousness now. They sensed an underlying wrongness. Helga, the eldest, inquired of her mother when they might depart, when they could return home. Magda offered a smile and replied, "Soon, very soon, we will all be together, somewhere beautiful, somewhere peaceful." Goebbels spent hours writing. His final propaganda piece, a testament to National Socialism, a justification of all their actions. He wrote of sacrifice and glory, of dying for a cause, of how future generations would comprehend and honor their choice. It was eloquent, powerful, and utterly insane. April 30th, afternoon. Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony. He then bade farewell to the remaining staff, shaking hands and expressing gratitude for their service. He released them from their oaths, urging them to attempt escape if possible. Goebbels was among the last to see him. They spoke briefly. Hitler presented him with a few personal items, a painting, a signed photograph, token gestures at the end of the world. Then Hitler and Eva Braun retired to his private chambers. A single gunshot echoed, followed by silence. Goebbels stood outside the door, awaiting confirmation. When Hitler's valet emerged and confirmed what everyone already suspected, Goebbels nodded slowly. He went to inform Magda. She received the news with an unnerving composure. "Now we can go too," she said. "But not yet. First, the children." May 1st, evening. Magda Goebbels prepared her children for sleep. She informed them they were embarking on a journey, a long one, and needed rest beforehand. The children, exhausted from days spent in the bunker, offered no resistance. They donned their nightgowns and brushed their teeth. Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, Hitler's personal physician, was present. He carried morphine and cyanide capsules. The plan was to sedate the children first, then administer the poison while they slept, ensuring they would feel nothing and be unaware. Helga harbored suspicions. At 12 years old, she was old enough to comprehend that a terrible event was unfolding. She clung to her mother. Magda held her, stroked her hair, and hummed a soft lullaby from Helga's infancy. One by one, the children succumbed to sleep. The morphine acted swiftly. They lay in their beds, 6 small forms in white nightgowns, breathing slowly and peacefully. Then Magda crushed the cyanide capsules between their teeth. It took mere moments. Their breathing ceased. Their small bodies grew still. Magda stood over them, tears streaming down her face, yet she made no sound. She had murdered her children, sacrificing them for ideology, for loyalty to a deceased man and a lost cause. Goebbels entered the room. He looked upon his deceased children. His expression was unreadable. He took Magda's hand. They left the room together, closing the door behind them. They ascended the stairs to the garden above. The Reich Chancellery was in ruins. Fires blazed everywhere. Soviet soldiers were only blocks away. The sounds of combat were incessant, overwhelming. Goebbels and Magda stood together in the garden, enveloped by the smoke and chaos of Berlin's demise. An SS guard stood nearby, armed with a pistol. The plan was for him to shoot them after they ingested cyanide, ensuring their demise. Magda bit down on her capsule first. She collapsed. Goebbels watched her fall. Then he bit down on his own capsule. The guard shot them both. Their bodies lay in the garden amidst the rubble and destruction. The master propagandist was dead. The man who had controlled Germany's narrative for 12 years had penned his final chapter. It concluded with murder and suicide, with children slain by their parents, with a city ablaze and a nation devastated. Later, Soviet soldiers would discover the bodies. They would find the children in their beds, peaceful in death, poisoned by those who should have protected them. They would find Goebbels' diary, his final writings, his testament to a cause that yielded only destruction. And they would discover something else, something that illuminated the ultimate irony of Joseph Goebbels' existence. Throughout the war, Goebbels had ruthlessly controlled information. He dictated what Germans could know, what they could read, what they could hear. He molded perception through pervasive messaging, convincing his populace of impending triumph when defeat was the only logical outcome, fostering faith in leadership that was inexorably guiding them towards oblivion. Yet in his closing moments, Goebbels himself became a casualty of his own manufactured narratives, a victim of Hitler's pervasive propaganda. The Führer's flights of fancy transmuted into Goebbels' stark reality. The falsehoods he had meticulously crafted became his own inescapable confinement, just as they had ensnared millions of Germans. He clung to hope until the very brink, convinced some extraordinary intervention would rescue them, that reinforcements would arrive, that an opponent would launch an assault, that the Western coalition would shift its allegiance. His conviction stemmed from a decade and 2 years spent conditioning Germans to embrace the improbable, and his own methodologies turned inward. The architect of illusions was himself deluded. The master manipulator was manipulated. The individual who crafted false realities perished in the throes of his own deceptions. When the intelligence arrived on April 25th that Berlin was entirely encircled, Goebbels finally encountered the singular verity he could not distort. There was no possibility of evasion, no prospect of relief, no miraculous intervention. Only the conclusion he had perpetually foreseen as feasible, yet never truly internalized. His reaction, that moment of profound stillness, that quiet utterance, "No one is coming. We are utterly alone," was perhaps the sole instance of unvarnished sincerity Joseph Goebbels displayed in his final weeks. Subsequently, having conceded to the facts, he opted for self-annihilation rather than endure existence within them. He made the decision to end his children's lives, to shield them from a world where National Socialism had faltered. His allegiance to Hitler superseded all else, including the very existence of his own progeny. This was the ultimate manifestation of an unwavering devotee, a zealot incapable of compromise or adaptation, unable to acknowledge that the entire edifice to which he had dedicated his existence was built upon a foundation of untruths. Berlin succumbed on May 2nd. Soviet troops unfurled their banner atop the Reichstag. Hostilities in Europe would officially cease on May 8th. Germany lay in ruins, divided, under occupation. Countless lives were extinguished. Cities were reduced to rubble. The Nazi regime was definitively over. And within the grounds of the Reich Chancellery, Joseph Goebbels met his end amidst the devastation. His manufactured pronouncements finally stilled. His pronouncements rendered utterly devoid of substance. His narrative concluded not with the grandiosity he envisioned, but with the squalid actuality he had consistently disavowed. The man who dictated the discourse perished when the discourse spiraled beyond his command. The man who inspired conviction died when conviction became an impossibility. The man who broadcast for 12 years fell silent when silence offered the only authentic response. This is the account of what transpired when Joseph Goebbels learned that Berlin was comprehensively surrounded. He confronted the unequivocal reality he had spent his entire professional life evading, and rather than coexist with that truth, he elected to embrace death for himself, for his wife, and for their 6 children who were never afforded a choice.